Regenerative Agriculture. I'm a crop and soil scientist. We're glad to have you here for this discussion on grazing cover crops, which has become a very popular approach in Missouri for a number of our livestock, particularly for cattle and sheep. And I'm pleased that we have with us today Josh Payne, who farms over in west central Missouri near Concordia, has the Rusted Plowshare Farm and has grazed both cattle and especially sheep on cover crops. And Josh has worked with cover crops for quite a few years now in a no-till operation on their farm, has done grain crops, but has kind of moved more heavily towards the livestock side of things. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to kick things off with some initial background material on grazing cover crops. And then Josh will take over and do the second half of the presentation, sharing some of his experience. And we'll have some time at the end for questions and discussion. So again, thanks. You can put questions in the chat at any time as we're going along. And then at the end, we'll either be able to take questions from the chat or you can offer them up directly over Zoom verbally. So again, welcome. This is the fourth in 4 webinars we were doing for folks here in Missouri this July. And you can expect we'll have more of these in the future. We have been recording these, so if you missed one of the earlier ones, those will be available through our Center for Regenerative Agriculture website. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and put this into presentation mode. And first of all, I would say one of the key things is that, you know, as we're looking at grazing cover crops, is thinking about what are the benefits of this. So for row crop farmers, it's certainly a way to get back the cost of the cover crop seed. I think a lot are doing it in part because they see it as a way to improve soil health, and that's something Josh can speak to from his personal experience. And it just gives us another way to, as we're adding those cover crops to our grain crop rotation, to have a chance to diversify those rotations. For livestock producers, it's an opportunity to save on feed when it might be most expensive, late fall through the winter, or trying to look at that late summer slump. Then we can also potentially on the same land unit increase the herd size, have some access to high quality forage. Instead of having to use our perennial pastures all the time, it gives us another base of forage on the farm. And it actually can be a good area for calving in the spring or fall, doing that out on the cover crop area as opposed to in a dry lot situation. So one thing we think about with cover crops as a forage is, are we going to harvest that forage by putting the animals directly onto it through grazing? Or are we going to harvest that by doing some sort of hay or baleage? We can do either. We have people in Missouri doing both of those approaches. I would say grazing is more common, and there's some reasons for that. First of all, if we're pulling that hay off of the field, then we're really removing some nutrients from the field. We have a little less soil protection. There's not as much biomass to feed the microbes. And maybe the main thing is we're not gaining some of that fertilization from the livestock's manure and urine. We also find even the saliva from those animals as they're grazing can stimulate the soil biology. So grazing of cover crops in place in the field seems to be the strongest approach for soil health benefits, but certainly harvesting the forage from the cover crop directly for baleage or for hay is another option we have available. So just thinking about some of the basics of grazing cover crops, there's often questions, you know, how am I going to make this work with fencing and water? You know, maybe the farm had fencing, but that's been removed long ago. So we're going to talk about that, and then how to maximize grazing in terms of picking some species. Josh will have a chance to tell you about what he's found that's worked with him. He's tried a lot of different cover crops, so got some great experience. And then kind of how we redesign the system. And that's when I'm going to turn this over to Josh, because he can talk to you about some of the different approaches he's used. So one of the things I hear come up a lot as I've talked to farmers, again, is this issue of fencing. You know, well, you know, it'd be great to graze some cover crops, but I just don't have any fencing on my farm anymore. And we tend to think of expensive perimeter fencing where we're putting in wood post or steel post and barbed wire or other, you know, more permanent fencing. But what I'm finding with a lot of the farmers that are grazing cover crops is they're relying on electric fencing. And there's reasons for that. The main one is that it's less expensive, but it's also easy to move. And we'll talk here in a moment about the benefits of doing some intensive management or rotational type grazing. So sometimes people say, well, you still got to have something around the perimeter of the farm. Well, depending on whether you've got cattle or sheep, you may be able to get by with 2 or 3 strands of electric wire as opposed to permanent fencing on the perimeter, and then a single strand on those interior paddocks. And Josh can talk about his experience with that. So there's this fear electric fencing is a hassle, and even if you might accept that it's a lower cost, there's still a thought, well, it takes time to put up. I've been seeing Josh do this, and he can do it very quickly. It's one of those things you get a little bit of experience and you figure out a system that works. Some people use ATVs to string it out, others just walk it out, depending on how much they're doing, but it can go up and down quite quickly. And then water, of course, is the other big issue. Understandably, people are thinking about, well, how am I going to get water to the animals? In our more typical Missouri pastures, we think, well, we've got a bigger pasture, maybe a 40-acre pasture. Let's think about getting a pond in there or running permanent piping to it. And that's great for that situation. But where we're making these smaller paddocks, grazing and cover crops, more often we see portable water tanks or some lower cost approaches. Maybe we're taking a 1,000-gallon trailer to the field behind a tractor or truck, filling that, just leaving it hooked up to that portable water tank and setting up the fencing so that the animals can move out of multiple paddocks to that water supply for a week or so before it's moved to another location. Of course, we've got to think about how we're going to handle that in the winter. I'm sure Josh has some horror stories about trying to keep the water accessible during the winter. One thing to think about in the cooler weather, cattle in particular, or probably sheep, can walk quite a ways to get to it. I've heard farmers say, yeah, they let their cattle walk up to a mile in cooler weather. We're not going to do that on a 100-degree day, obviously, but they can go pretty far to get access to that water. So the other big question we hear a lot is compaction, and I totally understand that. I come a little bit more from the grain crop side of things, and you hear a lot of corn and soybean producers say, yeah, I'm not so sure I want to have cattle out there because they may tear up my field. And there's no doubt that having cattle in particular, maybe less with sheep, can look a little, the ground can look a little rough after a wet period. But I've heard from many, many farmers now that they find that ground, even though it may not look perfect, is still pretty mellow for planting. In fact, I remember one farmer saying they could tell that it was easier to pull the planter through the area that had been grazed than through a field that had not been grazed, because just the ground was a little more mellow. What happens over time, especially, is these grazing animals tend to help build the aggregate soil structure. Of course, if it's extremely wet, we do want to get the animals off that field, maybe have a sacrifice lot that we're taking them to. So I mentioned earlier rotational grazing. So it's a little different strategy than, again, maybe where we have a permanent pasture where we're putting them out there for a multi-week period. We really, to get maximum benefit from these cover crops, want to keep moving the animals pretty regularly. Some folks do it every day. Some will do it every few days. But we're doing that in part to keep from trampling that forage, also to just make sure the animals are making full use of it, especially if we've got a mixture of species. If we're wanting to have some regrowth in the spring, we do want to keep an eye on the amount of grazing that's happening, depending on the particular species, keep it above 3 inches of vegetation, so we've got some regrowth potential. And then in terms of seeding rate with that cover crop, there's different thoughts on this. But the key thing to keep in mind is it's really only the cereal grasses that we might adjust the seeding rate for. If we're looking at the brassicas or legumes, we're probably going to keep those at the same rate we would use otherwise. There's not much advantage to boosting the rate on those. So for cereal grasses, let's say we're normally planting about 50 to 55 pounds of cereal rye. Yes, we might go up by 50% over that to have a little bit more potential with the grazing on the cereal rye or winter wheat, for example. But this particular graph shows a trial where they had 1.5 bushels of rye, which would be like close to 80 pounds, 2.5 bushels or 3.5, and there was really no statistical difference between those really high seeding rates in that particular location. So, You can, again, boost it somewhat, but don't need to go to extreme rates to keep the seed costs more affordable. And then with fertility, our bullet point here is it's often not worth the investment. There could be situations where it might be worth fertilizing depending on the cover crop that's being used and the time of year. But in the majority of cases, especially as we build healthy soils, we may be not needing to do that. Okay, the other thing we look about is how do we get more of a grazing season? We're going to look at some numbers on kind of rate of gain here in Missouri that we can get from grazing cover crops. And the more days we have for grazing, the better. It's not just the amount that the cattle can eat in any given day, but the total number of days out there. So one thing we can do is try to get that cover crop started earlier. We can fly it onto the field in late summer while the corn and soybeans are still growing, get a little earlier start. We could go even earlier. We could try interseeding. There's high clearance drills that you could seed in like June into corn. Now, the problem is if we have a dry summer like this year, that cover crop may go up, come up, and then sort of die out because there's not enough moisture competing with the corn or soybeans. Or we can have something that comes off the field a little earlier. We could have corn silage or popcorn, or put an earlier maturity soybean in there to try to get it off the field earlier. So that's one way to get more grazing time in the fall. The other thing we can do is look at the spring. You know, how do we get more grazing days in the spring? And part of that is to let the cover crop, of course, grow longer, doing an approach we call planting green, where we are planting our spring cash crop like corn or soybeans into a cover crop that's still living. So another thing we think about with grazing is which species to use. There's over 30 species of cover crops available. Many of them overlap with things we think of as annual forage crops. Of course, we're looking at nutritive value, what's the yield potential, and can they be regrazed? Can we both graze in the fall and then come back and do it in the spring? And again, Josh has a lot of personal experience with this. One thing you'll hear Josh talking about, he's done this with corn and soybeans, but he's also done it just looking at what can I get to work in the summer or maybe in early fall. So just having different things available at different times of the year for the animals in combination with pasture. So mixes are often a good idea for grazing because that helps us adapt to different weather conditions. Maybe one thing in the mix will do well if it's raining a lot, another will do better if it's drier, but also it just provides better nutrition for the animal rather than having a cereal crop or just having a legume. It also reduces the chance of toxicity issues. Let's say we have a field that's just sorghum stand grass. We could have some toxicity at certain times of the year, or if we have just a legume like a clover, we could have some bloat issues. So by having a variety of species out there in a mixture, we have less risk of those types of problems. And it's good for soil health, which is often part of the goals for doing this type of system. So here's some data from Rob Cullenbach, who's our associate dean at the university, but had worked for many years as our forage extension specialist. He did some detailed studies looking at some of our winter cereals like wheat, cereal rye, and also annual ryegrass to see what kind of rate of gain that cattle could get from those, grazing them as cover crops. And he found these figures you can see here, about 1.6 to 1.8 pounds daily gain, which is quite good. That's better than we'd often get on pasture situations. What's different here is on the right column, the total gain. So what's happening is, in his experience, there were more days of total grazing available from cereal rye. It'll grow longer into the fall, start up a little earlier in the spring than wheat will. So even though it's not quite as good on a given day as wheat, there's just more days of grazing available. And then annual ryegrass is an even longer period, depending on how it's managed potentially. So grass options include the ones I just mentioned, cereal rye and winter wheat. Triticale is a hybrid or intermediate between rye and wheat. Wheat, by the way, is a little more palatable for the animals, but they'll certainly eat any of these winter cereals. Barley is not very often used as a grazing crop in Missouri, but it can be. Certainly as part of a mixture, it can be a good fit. And then oats is an interesting one. I've seen this on Josh's place. It'll get more fall growth than these other winter cereals, but then it does not overwinter, except maybe in southeast Missouri or extreme southwest Missouri. Annual ryegrass will overwinter, and it can have good rapid fall growth. The caution with that one is our weed scientists feel that it can be a challenging one to terminate, and farmers have sometimes experienced that. And there's chance of it being a herbicide-resistant weed down the road. So we have to be cautious with that one, have a good plan for terminating it if it's used. So those are some cool season grasses. There's warm season grasses. Again, Josh has used some of these, corn, sorghum sudan. These are things that are going to do better in the warmer months of the year. They're going to be easily killed by frost, but definitely produce a lot of biomass in the summer. The brassicas in general are more cool season plants. We've got a lot of options here as well. Most of them are going to winter kill in the majority of Missouri. There's a few that will overwinter in South Missouri. The ones that will overwinter for the whole state are canola and rapeseed. We have some that have tubers that can be grazed, like radishes and particularly turnips. These are generally high in protein, but it's going to work better to combine these with the grass if we can. And there's several things, again, sold here. Forage radishes and turnips would be the most common. Some farmers in Missouri have used canola as a grazing cover crop. Kale is an interesting one. We think of that as a vegetable for humans, but it is sold as a cover crop and can be a decent grazing source in the fall. And it'll grow into December, but not necessarily over winter, depending on location. And then the legumes. It's really nice to have some legumes that mix excellent nutritive value. They're going to help build the soil, but they don't tolerate heavy grazing well. So that can be an issue. If we're just using them by themselves, they're not going to produce a lot of fall growth. So it's good to have them with oats or a winter cereal. And there is potential of bloat if we're just having the legume and not mixing it with some other species. So lots of legume options. Crimson clover would be the most popular cover crop in Missouri. Certainly red clover is used a lot with our permanent pastures, as is white clover. Berseem can be a good forage, does not have the bloat issues, but it's not winter hardy in most of the states, except for the southern parts. Balance is a newer clover that has probably a little less bloat issues, and it's got good vigor in late spring. It's a little slower growing in the fall than crimson, but that's an interesting one. And several others. The one I'd be cautious about is hairy vetch. It can be toxic to cattle. So if we're going to have it in a blend, it should be a really low percentage, less than 10%. And then there's some warm season legumes. Soybeans historically were used as a forage for hay or direct grazing. Sun hemp is a newer one that comes from the tropics that works pretty well as a summer cover crop, as do cowpeas. And then mung beans are not quite as vigorous as cowpeas, but they're another one that does well in the heat and dry conditions. Lots of broadleaves. You would not graze any of these as a sole crop. These would only be used in mixtures, things like sunflowers, buckwheat, maybe okra or flax. But of this list, probably sunflowers and buckwheat would be the ones you'd see most often. So some things to be aware of. We need to pay attention to these potential toxins like nitrates. There's some good publications on this, what to watch out for. You can have forage sent off and be sampled for nitrates. The general approaches are to, again, have a mixture of things to avoid any particular issues, and then to avoid grazing either right after the end of a drought, like we just had this big rain. Maybe would stay off of a field that's just gotten a big rain after several weeks of drought, or right after a frost. Stay out of that field for 5 days or so. Prussic acid can be an issue in our sorghum-related grasses. So again, right after a freeze, that can be an issue, especially if it's not a hard freeze, or if we're coming out of a drought. So again, we just need to be a little careful with timing of going into those fields. So those are just some general background things, but I really am excited to have Josh on to talk about his direct experience. And so Josh, turn it over to you.
And there's so much in there, Rob, that I wanted to jump in on, but maybe we'll get to some of those in the questions. Because yeah, it's there's fun ways. For example, like that baling. Like one of the things that we're experimenting with is baling, baling something and then leaving those bales in that field and coming back and like not removing the nutrients and bale grazing that throughout the winter. It's a lot easier to get out there, but we can talk more about that later. yeah, so one of the things that we've had to do is we've had to rethink our cropping systems so that we can include livestock and then exclusively move to livestock using annual forage chains largely. And so then as we're thinking about that, of course, we have to think about the normal things like profit. It's also nice because we get a diverse streams of revenue, whether that's for us direct market meats or whether that's custom grazing, like for $1 a head a cow or something like that. But the other thing that it's really hard to quantify, and like people can do this pretty well, is like livestock really improves soil health quickly, especially in say a corn, soy, small grain, big cover where you have a chance to graze that big cover and then go back into corn. That next corn crop, we've seen like when we did this a couple years, we saw close to a 20% yield increase in the corn following that small grain. And so, but there's some good stuff there. So go ahead, next slide, Rob. And so then to do this, like one of the things that's nice about covers is they can help fit some of those slumps. For example, the summer slump is kind of hard. We'll talk about that in a second. But in winter, we can have cereal rye that we have growing in a field, and we can graze that a large part of the winter, or we can stay off it, and then we can hit that in early March, right before fescue starts to green up. If I was gonna do this in a cropping system now, I would rethink this. I would rethink this slide a little bit. So the summer slump, you'll notice, is from June. Starts in June and then July and August with fescue. So the hard thing is you have to plan ahead 60 days for grazing one of these covers. So to have something in June and July, you'd have to plant something in April and May to hit that summer slump. So what we do often is we'll go in April and we'll plant grazing corn, in a mix, but primarily grazing corn. And then we'll plan on grazing that in June. And then in May, we'll plant sorghum Sudan, and then we'll be able to graze that in July. Now, you should be saying, well, that's in place of a cash crop. And there are really good situations to do that. Like right now, we just got done calculating how much we're making per acre on that corn, how much we made per acre on the corn and soy. And we end up with about 500 animal units on about an acre and a half every day. It ends up being with sheep math because sheep are pretty good money. So we end up making close to $500 an acre on this one graze. So like there could be reasons to forego a cash crop for a year out of 7 and some kind of a diverse rotation. But more so, I think if I was going to do it in a corn, soy, small grain, I would go to a local farmer or a local rancher and I'd tell them to come, or I'd ask them to send me cows in August so then I could plant my covers after wheat harvest in early July. I could be ready to graze by mid-August, and then especially if I stay away from sorghum Sudan, I could then graze from mid-August all the way through a lot of the winter, depending upon that. So that's a really nice option. The other one, I think Rob mentioned planting green earlier. There's a really nice window in there in April and early May that you can graze cows or sheep ahead of planting soybeans. I've actually seen one of my neighbors. He planted soybeans and grazed the rye like 3 or 4 days after he planted them, and then got them off as soon as they started to come up. I don't know if I would recommend that or not, but it worked in that one situation. But yeah, so like there's another nice window right in there that fits really well with corn and soy. Plus, the entire winter thing. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Rob. Yeah, so then the nice thing, we've talked about a lot of this stuff. I think the biggest one is that you get a chance to get off your pastures, and that allows them to rest. You have compaction recover. Like one of the things we don't think about, if you have clover in your pasture, if you can get off your pastures in August and September, clover has a chance to reseed itself, which then saves you money and fertility next year. Also, there's different times and different reasons with different breeds to alleviate fescue toxicosis. For me, particularly with sheep, if I can have a really nice fall annual, or summer annual or fall annual that's planted even after corn, I can flush my sheep. They need to be flushed in like November, and we can get really nice conditioned animals by grazing these small, or like by grazing covers, and that we can graze in mid-November to December. And that really increases our like our ewe lamb conception rate and our incidence of multiples per animal. So go ahead, Rob. So then, and these are the things that you always have to figure out, like infrastructure costs. Like fencing is really, really pretty cheap, especially if you can do it pretty portable and save that for future operations. Cover crop seed, I think the nice thing is oftentimes cost share is available. The problem is you often can't graze it below 3 or 4 inches. So if that's going to be an issue with the grazer, the thing that I have trouble with both cows and sheep is they like to graze really short. Like I can have a tall plant of cereal rye and there'll be clover along with it, and they'll just graze the clover completely out. I find it really hard to manage for a certain height. The other thing that's hard that has to be considered is like cover crop growth. So for example, we planted this nice summer mix of corn and soy and sunflower and turnips and radishes. And it was 90 degrees in April, and then it was 45 degrees for 15 days and really wet. We had a lot of corn that didn't come up. So like the hard thing with annuals is there are establishment issues. And we'll talk about this in a second, but that's why like a custom rent is a good, or a custom grazing is a good option, because then you can wait till you have something, and then you can get animals into your farm. It's just a little bit less risky that way. Go ahead, Rob. So Sarah, for example, says that you can make $49 an acre more from returning cover crops. They assume certain things. You're going to get 1,500 pounds of dry matter. I'd say it's pretty close. You're going to lose part of that, but it replaces more hay. And then when hay is valued at $80 a ton, you end up making 50 bucks an extra, 50 bucks an acre extra. I guess what I would say is, and what I'm learning now is that in times of drought, hay's not $80 a ton. Hay often is, like hay right now is 120 or 160, depending upon where you are a ton. And so these grazing economics work well normally, but they work even better when there's a drought situation or when there's an adverse climate situation. So go ahead. So again, here's another couple examples from the Practical Farmers of Iowa. I was doing some research the past couple of days. They have some really nice rental rates, like some nice models of how to make this work financially for both the owner of the livestock and the landowner. So they're a really nice resource. But you'll notice, I think there's something that's really important to see here. The first one is cereal rye planted in September. The second one is something planted early August, and then you see the mixes of brass. But I mean, there's a large difference in both biomass and grazing value between something planted in September after corn, say corn comes out September 15th-ish, or in early August, say at corn silage time. We've tried harvesting wheat early July, waiting for 3 weeks, and then planting something in August, so we'd have a winter component as well. That has not worked well for us because we don't use chemicals either. Typically, weeds, water hemp, crabgrass starts to grow in and becomes too competitive to get that stuff in August. But man, like the people that I know who have corn silage and they can plant a really nice cover in early August, they really get that 1.5 to 4 tons an acre, and that's really where you can make a lot of money on these things. So there's ways to do that. Go ahead, Rob. And again, just a couple more examples. You see steers grazing 31 days on cool season covers, interseeded into corn. They profited $185 an acre. Same thing in Minnesota. Stockers grazed the cover crop following winter wheat. They made $150 an acre. So the money's there. It can be anywhere from 30 or 40 or 50, but it could also be up to a couple $100, or with a big summer mix, like I said, we're making upwards of $400 an acre grazing that. So there's some ways to do this for people who don't own animals. But you gotta figure out who's going to do what. It's hard. So who's going to cover the cost of the cover crop seed? Who's going to plant it? Who's going to build the fence? Who's going to take the fence up? Who's going to move the animals? Um, are we gonna charge based upon the forage yield and then the value of the forage? How do we know what the value of the forage is? All of these are like you can take a forage sample and you can get a dry matter calculation, and then how long they're going to be. I think the big one in terms of grazing time, that's a really important one. If you're a farmer and you know that you want them off by February 15th or by March 15th, like that needs to be spelled out early. That way that way the livestock owner knows exactly when that's going to be. And it's hard because sometimes things have to be flexible. So it can be as simple as a fee per acre or a fee per pound of gain. If I was doing this with stockers, this is what I would do. I would get a bunch of warm season annuals and I would put stockers on because they need a really high protein diet. So we would run that. You can also do something where you calculate the price of hay, figure in the pasture quality factor, figure out the animals, and then you can figure out how you can make the math work there. So I talked about this in terms of sheep. Like we had an unheard of number this last year. We had 93% of our ewe lambs, like that's first year born in May lambs, be pregnant. Most people are around between 45 and 50, and I really contribute that to grazing winter annuals in the fall. So I think we see those health benefits of the high value, high energy, high protein annuals, but I mean, you also see it in calves too. You think about what a mama cow needs. She needs better nutrition so that she can provide milk and energy for her baby while she's lactating. And so if they're out there on a green, lush, growing cover, that's just going to be better for her and the animal. So some of these things like you just almost have to know your animal and what they need exactly at that time. Like for example, annuals for us with sheep, and you don't have to go back around. Annuals for us with sheep that we lamb May 15th. That means they need a really high quality forage right when fescue starts to hit that slump, right in early June. So that's why if we can have grazing corn, we can also have sorghum sudan. We can roll out a chain for June and July, so that those moms can really help those young lambs grow quickly. Another thing, there's a wildlife component. You have tall cereal rye, you have really nice habitat for quail, birds, you have less slug issues and less vole problems by going in and grazing that before you're going to plant. And then just the increased presence of life, like plant life is always going to bring about an increased presence of insect life, which is good. So, in summary, like they can really be profitable for row crop operations. It's like it seems complicated, but as someone who started with zero knowledge, it can be overcome pretty quickly. It's incredibly beneficial for soil health, and it really provides a nice opportunity to diversify cropping systems when you have gaps in forage.
So Josh, what are some of your favorite cover crops for grazing the sheep? And I know you've done a little bit of grazing with cattle too. What have you found that you've liked?
Yeah, you mentioned this earlier. I love the combination of fall oats and then a winter cereal, and then your clovers and your brassicas. What's nice about the oats is they really grow fast in the fall. Then you have that layer of green underneath. But for us trying to finish animals, we can, like when those oats frost kill, they become higher in energy. So they really balance out the nutritional needs of even a growing finishing animal. So I really like that mix. Our rule of thumb is we try to have 4 different plant families. So we're not so much worried about the 30 mix blends, but like our sorghum sudan that we're grazing right now, it's sorghum sudan, hay beans, like early soybeans, sunflowers, and then we had brassicas, and we had sugar beets. So we had five plant families in that. So
That's an unusual one, sugar beets in there. I didn't even know you were trying that one. That's good. Well, let's take some questions from the audience. You can either type your questions in chat or just unmute yourself and ask your questions. So. And while folks are thinking of their questions, I'll ask another one. So you just talked about what you like in the fall and a little bit and what you're doing in the summer. Have you found that there are good options? Like, let's say you're not going to put a cash crop in and you just want to get an early forage, like in June and July. What do you do in that situation?
yeah, I mean, there's nothing better than a grazing corn planted in April. Because like you can plant corn pretty early and it tolerates some of those, some of the early season coolness. So a corn with mixture of soybeans, like I said, we planted ours April 20th this year, and it turned out pretty well.
And for water, I know you're running permanent lines to some of your grazing areas, but have you used portable tanks and water? What have you used for more temporary type watering situations?
We've used portable water for way too long, Rom. We love those IBC totes. We can pull those around. They have 250 gallons, and if we have to do that every day, we can. We also have the 1,000-gallon tank we stuck in the back of an old grain truck that we haul around, and kind of depend upon wetness. You mentioned winter. Winter's great fun, but I mean, there's easy things to be done about that. Ours, I mean, we do have permanent water lines now, and so a trickle flow will work pretty well as long as you can keep that floating out away from the tank.
And I know I've heard with sheep that sometimes it's a little more difficult than fencing in the cattle. The cattle might be fine with a single strand of electric fence. So what's your approach with the electric fence and the sheep?
Yeah, we try to have as good a perimeter fence as we can. However, if I was going to go to somebody else's farm, I would put up probably a three strand temporary around the outside, and I would start by the road, and I would graze then away from the road, because then they would never want to go back to it. So, and the other thing is that these annuals are typically such high value, high quality, that they can't escape across the fence line and find something better. So they typically don't. So that's like my unique deal, is I would move away from the road, because I don't.
In your interior paddocks, are you doing 1 or 2 strand fencing for your interior?
We use something called Gallagher Smart Reels, and they're 330 feet long, but they're 4 strands, and they work really nice for lambs. Like, lambs like to go wherever they want, which causes problems. But if it was just ewes, I would just run 1 line on the inside. So, but we just like they're flexible enough and easy enough that's what we use.
Any questions from the audience yet?
I have a question. What has been kind of your biggest barrier to changing over and adopting these practices? What has been the hardest thing that you've come across? Oh,
Is that for me?
Yeah.
Yes,
Oh.
that's true.
Well, I'll ask Rob later, but yes, you.
Yeah. So, boy, there's a lot of them. I think for me, like the learning curve, like I grew up with just row crops, corn and soy. And so having to deal with animals, like that was kind of an interesting one. And so I think like that was a part of it, but then like the challenges are like water, like water's a hard one. So, and even I think finding here's a different variety of that. Finding people who are willing to trust somebody with no experience with animals, with your animals. Because
Yeah.
that's it's really hard. Like, hey, I've never been around animals. Can you bring yours to my farm?
Yeah.
So
Do you have any suggestions for folks who are just kind of interested in, maybe trying out bringing in livestock?
Well, we just sent 10 sheep home with a guy who was in that situation yesterday. I think, starting small and starting with lower value animals that are less likely to hurt you is a good option. But even then, I like what I did was I paired up with a neighbor who was a friend of mine in high school, who has cows. And I said he was going to take care of them. And I said, hey, can I just go out and move these things a little bit every day? He's like, I'm not going to do that. I said, sure, but can I? And so that gave me a chance to like learn alongside of him and then to try something different for him too. And he does that now too. So it's like working with that experienced person, maybe letting them do the grazing and you trying something like a little different works pretty good.
And you started with sheep, Josh, but then you've started to add more cattle to your operation. What would you say are key differences between grazing sheep on cover crops versus grazing cattle on cover crops?
I mean, cows like grass more. Sheep love the little tiny leaves. Like they'll like with Korean lespedeza or even like mare's tail and water hens. Like sheep just nibble off all the leaves, whereas cows want to take big grass. So I'll watch cows graze corn, and I'll watch them graze sorghum sudan and big leaf soybean plants. But then not as much the small stuff. And that's what makes them pair really well together. And cows run a lot faster. So I realize why people have horses.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, this recording will be available for folks if you want to share it with anyone else. We'll get that put up on the center's website soon. And Kelly, where's the particular site these will be at on the center's website?
They'll be in resources on our website. I'll share that right now. And I will also send a follow-up email with some other resources that are relevant to this topic and where you'll be able to find the YouTube video of this. So yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Yes, thanks very much, Josh. And thanks to those of you who joined us to learn a little bit more about grazing cover crops. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Enjoy the rain. Bye.